Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation about the ideas and the leaders that are shaping our democracy. I am Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice. It was 25 years ago that the 2000 election took place. And for many people, that will bring a shiver of memory. It was an extraordinarily close election, presidential election between Vice President Al Gore and Texas Governor George W. Bush. Gore won the popular vote, but the Electoral College all came down to one state, Florida. And even though 6 million votes were cast, the difference between Bush and Gore was a few hundred votes. The networks on television called it for one candidate, then another. Vice President Gore called Bush to concede and then withdrew the concession. It was an extraordinary evening and then an extraordinary month as legal challenges and recounts, which are under the law what you get when an election is that close, pinballed around the courts, pinballed around state courts, and ultimately led to a recount ordered by the Florida Supreme Court, which was stopped by the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court issued a very controversial opinion, Bush v. Gore, that effectively settled the presidential election. It raises legal questions, historical questions, partisan questions, and the question of how relevant is this episode from history to us today? Did this stand alone because of the really extraordinary circumstances of basically a tie presidential election, or did it set us off in certain directions that we're living with now? And what can we learn from it? We're really fortunate to have some of the leading people in this story with us to talk about their very different perspectives on this. And it's a real privilege for us to have that chance. First, I'm going to talk to Ben Ginsberg. Ben was the national counsel for the Bush-Gore campaign. He was perhaps the preeminent Republican election lawyer of recent decades and a prominent voice even to this day on the rule of law. And he was very involved in arguing these cases all throughout that hectic month. Ben, it is my understanding that before the election, someone said to you, what if this has to go to a recount? Is that true? And what did you say?
It is true. It is true. It was the day before the election. People stopped calling lawyers right before the election. So the legal team was out to lunch in Austin. Somebody said, what would happen if there was a recount? And I said, that's ridiculous. That would never happen. That is purely a lawyer's fantasy. And there can be such a thing as a lawyer's fantasy. There won't be a recount, just too many moving parts. Too many states involved, never, ever, ever happened. Well, sometimes you're wrong.
That's what lawyers call fan fiction, is that kind of thing. But obviously, by early in the morning, the day after Election Day, it was clear that Florida was where this was going to be happening. If you could tell us, as somebody who was so central to this, what had to happen in terms of the Bush campaign mobilizing, and what was the strategy that you envisioned pursuing over the sort of the chess match, the ping pong game, however this played out in dizzying ways for those of us on the outside over the coming weeks?
Well, I was in the Bush headquarters in Austin, and about 2:30 in the morning, we realized there was going to be a recount in Florida, and the margins were getting closer and closer. And so the chairman of the campaign, Don Evans, came up to me and said, time to scramble the troops. We're going to go to a recount. And one of the wonderful things about people in campaigns is that they know how to do almost impossible acts really quickly and efficiently. So there was a flotilla private planes commission. We assigned people to go to various jurisdictions in Florida. And by 5 o'clock in the morning, people were flying to various parts of Florida. I left at about 10:30 the next morning, and we made stops in Tampa, Orlando, and Jacksonville before arriving in Tallahassee. we were ahead. And so our strategy whenever you're ahead is repeating the truism that you only need one more vote than your opponent to be elected. And so we were interested in all the votes that were coming up and the allegations that were being made, but we were determined to have an accurate count under Florida rules and laws as they existed on election day.
And fast forward a few weeks, though it might have felt like a few years, but it was only a few weeks, to when the Florida Supreme Court had laid out a plan for recounts in some counties, and the Bush-Cheney campaign appealed to the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court. Did you expect that you would have to do that sooner or later, or what went into that decision to go to the U.S. Supreme Court?
Well, we were pretty convinced when the Democrats started crying about count all the votes, but then were very careful to only go into their 4 best counties to do that counting. So we foresaw, given the partisan makeup of the counting boards in 3 of those 4 counties, that we were likely to be involved in litigation. And there was certainly a lot of litigation in all the lower courts. So Secretary James Baker said to us about 2-3 weeks into the recount, this is going to go up to the Supreme Court. I had been involved in an earlier recount in Indiana 8 called McIntyre versus McCloskey, in which equal protection had really formed the basis of a decision that went against us at the time in what we thought was a very unfair election. And so the notion of a federal court route through equal protection was sort of on the table from the beginning. The Florida Supreme Court itself managed to reverse 2 Florida trial courts who actually tried the facts of the case without much justification. And we were certainly aware that the partisan makeup of the Florida Supreme Court was much more Democratic than the U.S. Supreme Court was Republican. So we were not surprised at the Florida Supreme Court decisions. And we anticipated that there might be an appeal up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And thanks to the wonderful legal work of Ted Olson and his team, we were prepared to take it and did in pretty prompt fashion, especially once the Florida Supreme Court ignored the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in the Palm Beach County case, Bush versus Gore 1, and then basically changed the rules of the game under which the election had been run.
So let's talk a bit about Bush v. Gore, the U.S. Supreme Court case, because you've really raised some interesting points there. First off, in a sense, was the decision by the court to take the case and stop the counting really the most significant part of it, as opposed to the arguments and the decision itself?
The Florida Supreme Court ruling in the Palm Beach County case that then got reversed 9-0 by the U.S. Supreme Court about 10 days before Bush versus Gore itself was, I think, actually kind of the turning point case that the Florida Supreme Court's decision and the way they acted was reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court. And then especially the Florida Supreme Court, for reasons I don't understand and would still love the annals of history to address, decided to ignore that first case, the Palm Beach County case. And so when the second case that became Bush versus Gore went up, I think a great part of the reason we were successful was the Florida Supreme Court not addressing the issues raised by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Palm Beach County case.
And, we see this, of course, today, that kind of the interplay between the courts, and they sort of get their hackles up if they think they haven't been listened to. I want to ask you about something you said about the equal protection argument, because, of course, that was ultimately what was the basis for what mattered most in the Supreme Court's argument. A lot of people think, well, that kind of came in at the last minute. It wasn't really central to the arguments in front of the court. And certainly Clarence Thomas, to use one example, has not cited the Equal Protection Clause much, if ever, before or since. But your point is that it actually, from your perspective, it was not a surprise.
No.
That you've raised it earlier, and that the earlier recount relied on it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, look, the essential thing that you want done in a recount is to have similarly marked ballots in different jurisdictions counted the same. We knew from 6 weeks, 30 days of recounting ballots in Florida that similarly marked ballots were being treated very differently, not only within the same county, but certainly in juxtaposition between the four counties that the Democrats wanted to count. So we believed that the equal protection uh, argument would be a key part of what happened, because that principle of counting similarly marked ballots the same is so essential. The Florida Supreme Court had the power to fix that in their second decision, and they put absolutely no standards in. So we were not surprised in the Friday after their ruling, and after a 5-hour hearing to work on the rules of the recount, in which it turned out there were none, no consistency between ballots, it was not a surprise to us that that became a central focus of the U.S. Supreme Court decision. And of course, the equal protection part of that decision was a 7-2 rule.
And I want to talk about the court itself and what the ruling did and didn't do, both for the court's own standing, but also as the start of the 25 years of changes in how elections are run and perceived in the U.S. You talked about the partisan makeup of the Florida Supreme Court, which is my understanding is those were elected.
Not elected, appointed.
Not elected. They were
Appointed by Lawton Childs.
Back in the hard to imagine days when Democrats were elected governor of Florida, and the number of Republican appointees on the U.S. Supreme Court. And of course, the Supreme Court is always political. It's the nature of the kind of court like that. But do you think that this was a start of people seeing it as more partisan? In other words, being really aware of the political party that nominated the different justices?
Well, I appreciate that. That is much of the theory. I think that it is not easy to find the evidence of that in the 15 years after Bush versus Gore that you see today in that theory. I think that in the immediate aftermath of Bush versus Gore, there was certainly a lot of academic writing that said that the court was going to lose its moral authority in the country. I think you'd be hard pressed to find that in the decade following Bush versus Gore. I think it is certainly through the lens in which we're seeing everything now, which is certainly a much more partisan and polarized lens. We do look at that, I think, much more for U.S. Supreme Court decisions. But I don't think that was the immediate impact of the case.
In other words, when you think about cases, whether from Citizens United, Shelby County, all the cases subsequently, and certainly the stuff now involving President Trump, it really it's in the same century you're arguing as Bush v. Gore, but you would suggest you can't trace the line from that there.
Well, I think the two cases you mentioned were a full decade after Bush versus Gore. And I think you're hard pressed to find it before that. I mean, I think there were a series of things that happened in the country for a period starting before Bush versus Gore that tended to pull us apart more and polarize us. But it's been, sort of a slow process, so that Bush versus Gore showed what partisan combat can be, but there was not the partisan combat in 2004, which was still a pretty close election, and not in 2008 or 2012. I think Citizens United was a case that we could probably argue for a good long time, but I don't see that as really springing from Bush versus Gore.
It's interesting. I've always thought that one of the consequences of not of the case so much, but of the whole thing, the recount, the election, what was revealed about the electoral system in Florida and elsewhere, was that the parties really changed their view of how important this stuff was. When I was doing politics in the 90s, people were very focused on buying lots of ads to appeal to a very small sliver of swing voters. And I think one of the things that 2000 taught the parties was that turnout or not turnout really mattered, and that the machinery of elections were rickety potentially and could be manipulated. And you've actually been very active over the years in trying to fix that machinery of the elections. First, I want to see if you agree or disagree with that basic starter gun that I think was not legal so much as political, but you were the co-chair, for example, of the commission with Bob Bauer, who was President Obama's counsel, to find ways to make elections run better. You've worked on that, but do you agree that the politicization of how we run elections is markedly different than it was in the 80s or 90s?
Yes, I think it's amplified. Look, I've been doing recounts since 1982, so I didn't need a whole lot of persuading that the mechanisms of our election system is creaky, and I think that's still true today. I think that's because we made a policy decision 240 years ago to really have local control of elections. And so we have somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 separate jurisdictions doing voting. Nobody knows how many exactly, which is sort of an indication of the problem, but you're not going to get uniformity when that happens. Anyone who had kicked open the hood of an election in a recount, whether Republican or Democrat, realizes that the system is built not for precision. And so Bush versus Gore, because it was such higher stakes than any other recount, really focused much, much more on that. But I think the equal protection problems that surfaced in Bush versus Gore is really the Achilles heel of the voting system, and is amplified today as people look more and more at election administration, largely because we are such a more polarized and politicized country today. So the work that Bob and I do with the election system, starting with that, was really a series of best practices and recommendations to all jurisdictions to make the voting experience better and more reliable. And we continue that work today in various forms, but we are very aware of, with so many jurisdictions, there will be differences amongst quality in those jurisdictions, and that's a problem.
And so it sounds as if you would argue that the fact that the court has not cited Bush v. Gore and the equal protection argument actually is not necessarily wise, that actually there are ways to improve our elections that might come from a more energetic use of that.
Yeah, I look. I think that it would be hard for the Supreme Court or for Congress to impose uniformity among jurisdictions. I mean, that would be an abandonment of the principles of federalism that have undergirded the country for a long, long time. But I think there can be more attention paid to differences among jurisdictions and the quality of the experience for voters in participating in the process, whether that's by ease of registration or quality of voting machines, or the way observers can watch the county, or the accuracy of voter registration lists. And so some sort of agreement on best practices for how to conduct the basic mechanisms of elections would ensure that a Bush versus Gore doesn't happen again, in the sense of equal protection being the fulcrum.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now we're going to hear from David Boies. I spoke with him. He was the attorney who represented Al Gore before the United States Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore. He's, of course, one of the preeminent litigators of our generation, a founder of a major law firm and a major voice in American law. David, I wonder if you could think back to that moment when you stepped up to the podium in the Grand Supreme Court chamber in this really big case, and you knew what was at stake, and you knew how significant this was politically and legally. And as you're getting ready to make your argument, did you think you had a chance? Did you think that this was something where the law would make the difference, or the political alignments? How did you see it going into the argument as you were thinking about it at the time?
Remember that as I was arguing in the Supreme Court, the court had already decided by 5-4 to stop the vote counting. They had done that before we briefed the issue, before we'd argued the issue. And it was pretty clear that the court had split along pretty much partisan lines in making the decision to stop the vote counting. And while you always hope the court will have an open mind, I think it was pretty clear that 5 justices on the court had already decided, without briefing and argument, that they were going to stop the vote count. And the problem is that, having stopped the vote counting on the prior Saturday, they had made it impossible to finish the vote counting by the so-called safe harbor deadline. Now, there was nothing necessary about that deadline. That deadline could be passed. But everyone had been focused on trying to get the recount done by the deadline, and the Supreme Court had now made that impossible. And of course, the way the came out was the court ultimately decided, when it decided the case, that because they passed the safe harbor deadline, they weren't going to allow the recount to continue at all, even under a different standard. So it was a little bit of a catch-22.
You have said, from your perspective, that the Supreme Court is always political, and that's really baked into the way it's set up. That's baked into the role it plays in our society, and certainly how the court has grown over the years in significance. But was this something where it was not only political, but in your view, partisan? And what's the difference there?
I think the difference is that the court makes ideological decisions, makes policy decisions, which in a democracy are inherently political decisions. You try to avoid that as much as possible, but to some extent it's inevitable. It is different, however, if the court intervenes to, in effect, put a thumb on the scale of political electoral decisions, partisan decisions. That is where the court, rather than simply articulating policy choices, is affecting how the legislative and executive branches function. And that is that's a serious question for a divided government, where you have separation of powers, where you have an intent that no institution has too much power. So I think that the court, while often ideological and sometimes political, has always tried to avoid being partisan. And I think there was certainly a perception of partisanship here.
We are looking at this now from the distance of 25 years, and it's not only a lens through which to look at this extraordinarily significant case, but everything that has come afterwards. And it was less than 2 years ago, of course, that this current Supreme Court issued a ruling in the middle of a presidential campaign with tremendous significance. The case involving immunity from prosecution for former presidents and ruling in a way that had not been what people expected for the entire history of the country, including the language of the Constitution, which clearly envisioned former presidents could be prosecuted. And that was something that had a big impact in Trump v. U.S. That case had a big impact, of course, on the course of that campaign, and indeed who sits in the White House today. Do you think that in some way what the court did, the way it did it, broke the taboo on the Supreme Court involving itself in electoral politics in the way that we saw this past year? Or were these circumstances and some of these are things that the court didn't have much choice about?
Well, I think the court certainly had a choice. But I would classify that decision more in the area of political, ideological decisions as opposed to partisan decisions. I don't think the court made that decision in order to affect the electoral result. I think I disagree with that decision. I think the accumulation of unrestrained power in the executive branch is something that our founders very much wanted to avoid. And I think it is something that all of the predecessors have, in various degrees, avoided. I think what we have here is sort of an open road for the executive branch to exercise unprecedented power. And I think that is very undesirable. But I think the court did that, perhaps influenced by who the president was at this particular point in time. But I think recognizing that the powers that are being granted here are going to inure to whoever occupies that office. So I think it was more of an ideological and to some extent political decision, but I don't view that as a partisan decision.
Bush v. Gore, while the court said don't ever cite this again, it did begin a series of cases, including Citizens United and Shelby County, where the court gutted the Voting Rights Act, and others where it was willing to be very activist around the elections in a way that it really had not been before. It felt to many of us like the kind of cork had been pulled out of the bottle. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or were these cases sort of each on their own terms?
Well, I think to some extent they were each on their own terms, but I think you're right that it started us down a pathway. And I think Bush v. Gore started us down a pathway of judicial participation, to use a neutral term, in our electoral process that had not been the case before. And I think the court has, to some extent, pulled back from that in some respects. I think the court, when confronted with some of the same kind of electoral issues that were decided in Bush v. Gore, has let the state courts make those decisions. I think the court recognizes that Bush v. Gore was a very troubling, very dangerous decision. I think they did at the time when they said, don't cite this case. This is for this case only. Although I think one of the real defects in that decision is deciding a case only for the particular facts that you have. The whole constraint on judicial power is stare decisis. It is the reliance on precedent, the adherence to precedent. It is the knowledge that when you decide a case one way, when the challenger is a Democrat, those principles are going to be applied when the challenger is a Republican. And it is the willingness of a court to apply principles neutrally, regardless of the identity of the parties, that is essential to the rule of law. And I think when a court decides a case in order to achieve a particular result, without being prepared to apply the principles that they articulate to subsequent decisions, that is very troubling. And as I say, undermines the rule of law.
It's a bad sign when a judicial body says, really don't follow this in the future.
Right.
That's not something that typically for those who are not Supreme Court litigators, you can confirm that doesn't usually happen.
It doesn't really happen, and it shouldn't happen.
Let me ask you a question from a realist perspective, or perhaps a cynical perspective, or perhaps a devil's advocate perspective. To me, one of the most extraordinary things about this whole situation, which was really even before you got involved, was the fact that because of the Electoral College, it all boiled down to this one state. And rather remarkably, despite the millions of votes cast, it was pretty close to effectively a tie. And whatever outcome there was going to be difficult and controversial, and somebody wasn't going to be happy. And whatever process was followed would be controversial. And again, would leave winners and losers and unhappy people as well as happy people. Given that the state legislature was controlled by George W. Bush's party, and the governor was, of course, his brother, and that the majority of the Supreme Court had been appointed by Republican presidents, ultimately, would we be upset, or would you have been upset in a sense by any outcome? In other words, was there any way this was not going to be ultimately, one way or the other, George Bush would become president rather than Al Gore at the end of the day? Or do you think that's not right?
I think that's not right. Remember, when the Supreme Court stopped the vote counting on Saturday, before we'd had any argument, the votes were almost going to be completed by the end of the day, and certainly by the following day. Essentially, half of the counties were almost done. So we were going to have a statewide recount pursuant to state law. You had a single judge monitoring the process, so that appeals from each candidacy board went up to a local judge, and then appeals from that went up to a single judge, and then appeals from that went up to ultimately the Supreme Court of Florida. So the idea that you were going to have differing standards, I think misunderstands what was going on in Florida. Florida had now set up a procedure where everybody could make those appeals. And remember that the idea that the candidacy boards made individual decisions was not anything new. It existed in 35 other states in the country. It had existed in Florida for over 100 years. And it was the process which the Bush camp argued in the Florida state courts was the way it had to proceed. So this was not anything unusual or unexpected. What was happening is the votes were being counted according to the rules that existed before the game started. Changing the rules in the middle of the game is what is the problem, or is one of the problems. And I think that if the vote count had gone forward now on a statewide basis, pursuant to judicial review, people would have had confidence in that. I think people would have accepted that result, regardless of who won. And it was very close. Afterward,
that's the very reason you want the rules to be followed and the procedures to be adhered to, is precisely because you need that confidence building protection that isn't being made up on the fly.
Exactly. And it's not being made up on the fly to benefit a particular candidate. So I think that if the Supreme Court had simply let the process continue, people would have had confidence in the result. And the question is not whether or not you should have a manual recount. As I say, 35 states provide for them. A number of states don't provide for them. The issue was that you always had manual recounts in Florida. And the issue was changing that rule in the middle of an election to benefit one candidate.
You got involved in this case somewhat in the middle of it, as I understand, and please tell me if I'm getting the chronology wrong, but really when it was clear this was something that was going to have to be argued in this way at the Supreme Court, the bat signal went up and you got involved. Could you tell me how that came about and why in fact did you take this case, given the challenges? What was it that impelled you?
Well, I was contacted on Thursday afternoon following the Tuesday election, and I immediately flew down to Florida, and I was down in Tallahassee by midnight on Thursday.
So it was earlier.
So it was relatively early, but it was after the election and after the first 48 hours, and after it had become clear that this was going to be a serious contested election and a seriously contested recount. And I thought it was this was a critical time for our democracy. The integrity of our voting system, the idea that every vote is going to be counted and is going to be counted pursuant to the rules at the beginning of the election, that the rules were not going to be changed during an election to eliminate, for example, in Florida, the manual recounts that had existed for over a century. That is something that is fundamental to our democracy and fundamental to people's confidence in the integrity of the electoral results, which in turn I think is essential to the ability of the country to come back together again after an election. Historically, we've had intensely, bitterly contested elections, but we come back together again. The losing candidate concedes, pledges support for the winning candidate. That has been an essential ingredient of keeping this country together. And once you begin to depart from that, once the rules get changed in the middle of the game, and particularly gets changed by a court that just by looking at the makeup of the court looks like there are some partisan aspects to it. I think that in confidence in the integrity of the elections begins to erode. And when that begins to erode, I think the ability to keep the country together is threatened. So I think that this was a critical point in our history. Fortunately, I think afterwards, I think there was a general recognition that this was something that should not be repeated. But it was something that I thought was important for any lawyer who had an opportunity to participate in it to step up. I mean, I think the thing that's important, I think there are two things that are really important here. One is that the court stopped the vote counting before they even heard the case. And second, that this was not a situation in which the issue was whether you ought to have manual recounts or not. You can argue that both ways as a matter of policy, and states are split. This was an issue as to whether the Supreme Court should, in a hotly contested presidential election for the first time in our history, intervene to effectively decide the election. And by intervening to deprive a state of following the procedures that had followed for 100 years. And I think that, and then issue an opinion that they say right at the beginning, they're not going to be prepared to follow in the future. Remember that the equal protection basis for the majority opinion was absolutely flatly inconsistent with equal protection jurisprudence of most of the majority justices. Not only did they abandon the principles that they had articulated in the past, but they then said, we're not going to abide by these new principles in the future. And I think that is something that seriously undermines the rule of law.
It did not convert Justice Thomas to be a major proponent of using the Equal Protection Clause in any cases that came either before or after.
Before or after, exactly.
Do you think that the quality of our elections and how the courts have addressed elections has eroded over time, and has trust in the Supreme Court eroded over time during the time after Bush v. Gore?
Well, I think trust in the Supreme Court has eroded, and I think that's demonstrated in the polls. I think it has
Lowest level ever recorded.
Right, exactly, and which is very troubling because, as Justice Breyer has frequently noted, the Supreme Court's authority and ability to play the role that it plays is dependent on people's willingness to adhere to its decisions. And I think the fact that you see people now saying, well, maybe we'll just ignore what the Supreme Court says, is indicative of that erosion of confidence in the court. I think that erosion has to some extent been driven by the same concerns about partisanship that drove the concerns about Bush v. Gore. I also think that it has been driven by the willingness of the court to depart from precedent. Whether it's Roe v. Wade or Citizens United or the Voting Rights Act, all cases where the court, and there are many others, have departed from precedent. And I think that when it looks like the Supreme Court is going to make it up as it goes along, depending on the political views of the justices, and this goes both ways, both liberal and conservative, I think the trust in the court does get eroded. And I think that is something that erodes the separation of powers that the founders thought was so important and has been so central to preserving our democracy.
As Justice Elena Kagan has said, when a change of personnel of one justice replacing another suddenly can lurch the court from one set of answers to an entirely different set of answers, the public loses trust that the court is actually acting as a court.
I think that's 100% right. And remember, we give the Supreme Court people who have never been elected lifetime appointments because we believe they will, and because we want to ensure that they are able not to respond to political pressure. And when it looks like the court is functioning as a super legislature, that is when I think people's confidence in the court and willingness to adhere to the court's decisions begins to dissipate.
As you know, or as you may know, public support for what we at the Brennan Center support, which is an 18-year term limit for justices. The most recent Fox News poll showed 79% of the public supporting term limits, not on ideological grounds, but because of the basic accountability, the notion that nobody should have too much public power for too long. And that would be part of responding to that sense that it's not acting like a court. Anyway, from our perspective, thank you so much. And I talked with Barbara Parianti. She was a justice on the Florida Supreme Court for many years. Indeed, she was the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court and was sitting on that court during that critical month of 2000. Justice Parianti, you were serving on the Florida Supreme Court in November and December of 2000, at the time when the court ordered a statewide recount of undervotes in the election. For those whose memories are dim, and for those who are too young to remember, why did you do this, and why was that important, and what is an undervote?
Well, it's wonderful to be here and to reflect on a quarter of a century ago. But we had a series of cases that we were deciding in that period of time. And one was a unanimous opinion. The second opinion came as a result of what's called an election contest, where the lawyers for Vice President Gore had asked for a recount or a count of votes that had never been uh, been recorded. In Palm Beach County, for example, and in many counties at that time, they had what's called punch card ballots, where if you push in and it doesn't go all the way through, but it's clearly a vote, it just wasn't that the machines recorded it, that would be called an undervote. So we had ordered a statewide recount of all those votes in counties where those undervotes had not been tabulated. And that's what was occurring or was to occur on December 8th of 2000 until December 9th, today, 25 years ago, when on a Saturday, when the counting had started in Tallahassee, the U.S. Supreme Court intervened and stopped the statewide recount.
And were you surprised when the court did that?
Unfortunately, we weren't surprised because there were indications earlier in the litigation. Again, there were several cases that had been filed and that the Supreme Court decided. And they had already shown an interest in what was going on in Florida. Now, obviously, the world was interested in what was going on in Florida, but as we see subsequently, the U.S. Supreme Court had a specific interest, and which they manifested when they stopped the recount on Saturday, December 9th. So was I surprised? Wasn't surprised. Was I upset? Very, because we had worked around the clock to do what we believed to be correct under Florida election law and the Florida statutes. We didn't reach out, federal law. This was a state election issue.
And Florida law calls for recounts under certain circumstances. As you said, there were so many cases sort of pinballing around the system, state courts, counties, federal courts, on so many different issues. Why do you think this one wound up being the one that was most significant in the end? And as you and your colleagues on the court were making rulings, how did you see your own role, in effect, as articulating the law, but also knowing the huge impact that your decisions were going to have?
It was done with great care. The system back then we had a fairly good computer system, but nothing like what it was in the next decades as far as being able to get out the opinions. We still were doing things the old-fashioned way, but we had many cases that we were issuing, opinions on, and we felt that we were doing it in a collegial manner and in a timely manner, because we were conscious of what we thought should be the deadline, which was December 12th, which is that safe harbor time under federal law, so that we had to have the votes certified and and done by that time, December 12th.
And one of the things that's quirky to those who didn't live through this is that the recounts were taking place in some counties in the state, but not in others. If you could share why that was, and did you ever think about ordering a statewide recount, or was that not something any of the parties had asked for?
In the very first oral argument, Chief Justice Wells had asked both parties, would they be willing to agree to a statewide recount? And, since Governor Bush was ahead, his lawyers said they couldn't agree. And at that point, there was no basis that wasn't before us to order a statewide recount. But you have to understand, back in 2000, we have 67 counties, well, we still do, in Florida, each with a separate supervisor of elections. Each supervisor of elections had the authority to design his or her own ballot. So by the very nature of that diffuse, separated system, there were going to be inconsistencies, and so that was really something that Florida had always dealt with. But until 2000, when the vote was so close, too close to call, it didn't. Those problems with the statewide and the election statutes did not really come into play.
This was the first time, I think, that most of the country saw partisan legal warfare on such an epic scale throughout the course of this month. It happens in individual cases, it happens in individual recounts, but it really was something that nobody had ever seen before. How do you think the kind of clamor and the notion that everybody was watching affected the system in this instance?
Well, I can say how it affected the Florida Supreme Court. First of all, at that time, Florida had a system of merit selection and retention for appointing justices. We were not appointed as Republicans or Democrats. We never discussed what our party affiliation was, and that never had come into play at all. We were a collegial court. Did we agree all the time? Not necessarily. And so that the hyper-partisanship that was going on in Florida with the Republicans and the Democrats, the independents, really did not affect our court. Obviously, personally, we could see what was going on. You know, you'd walk out at night, you'd leave the court, you see all these uh, cameras, stations from all over the world. So we knew that we were being watched. But I feel very proud of the work that the Supreme Court during the time I was on has always done. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Well, it's striking because, and this, of course, is an issue in all state Supreme Courts that get appointed or elected one way or the other. There's an endless challenge of how to insulate that from undue partisanship. But critics note that at that time, the Florida Supreme Court had been appointed by Democratic governors in the majority. But you're saying that didn't affect how you all looked at this issue.
Well, the way that ultimately a Democratic governor had appointed, not sure if all of us, because Governor Bush had come in. So I believe that even with Peggy Quince, one of the justices, she was a joint appointment. Major Harding was an independent thinker. So I don't believe that the fact that there was a Democratic governor affected how we ruled on cases, because the Judicial Nominating Commission was not Republican or Democrat. There were three that the governor appointed, but then there was three from the Florida bar and three that were at large citizens, ordinary citizens that were on those judicial nominating commissions.
As members of the nominating committee.
Which, by the way, changed after the 2000 election by Governor Bush. It was made much more partisan, as it's been, unfortunately, since then, in my view.
So, as you know, we've talked to the lawyers for the Bush campaign and for the Gore campaign, and they each, in effect, say that the other side wanted to change the rules in the middle of the game. How do you see that issue?
Do I get to be like the neutral decider on that?
I assume you agree with one of them and not the other, perhaps.
Well, I agree with our opinions, and again, I say that we could look at all the opinions that we decided in that period of time. There was an opinion on absentee ballots, the military ballots. There were absentee ballots in other counties that were not recorded properly. There were so many ways that this razor thin margin could have been influenced politically if we had politics in mind. But, you know, beyond the fact of what had happened with the purges of the voter rolls leading up to the 2000 elections in places like Jacksonville, Duval County, which had a very large African American population. So I don't, I understand that those that were for Governor Bush would see what we were doing as being partisan, but my answer is we had so many chances to have, quote, given the election to Vice President Gore through our opinions, and never did that happen. And we had no idea of what would happen with the statewide recount, which the U.S. Supreme Court stopped on this very day 25 years ago on equal protection grounds when they hadn't looked to see whether a single judge in Tallahassee who would have been looking at all the statewide undervotes and ensuring that there was a uniform standard to decide whether the vote was a legal vote or not. It doesn't really, it's not that difficult to see if a voter had intended to vote for a candidate. We're not talking about astrophysics here.
Since that month and those rulings 25 years ago, the courts at every level have gotten more involved in adjudicating and refereeing elections, and have gotten more involved in different election issues that inevitably are controversial, inevitably have the tinge of one party or another wanting a certain outcome. Do you think that that's an inevitable consequence of what happened? And is that a bad thing or something that actually helps bring stability to the system?
I guess that we'd have to look at each individual case. I mean, I obviously believe that the U.S. Supreme Court in their 5-4 decision, with Justice O'Connor saying afterwards that she felt that they had made a mistake, that led to the hyper-partisanship that occurred during our time period. I think by and large, now, for example, Florida has a very good system of elections. Our votes in Florida, they're the first to be certified. So I don't, and they're done in a legal way. So I think, that the outcome, at least for Florida, was to enhance our election procedures so that we are efficient and votes are properly counted. But I can't speak for listen, we live in a country of hyper-partisanship, which I find to be very distressing when, I've committed, my legal and my judicial career to caring about the rule of law. And that means adhering to precedent. That means respecting courts and judicial rulings, not having the executive overstep its bounds and what they're doing. And I think we are at a very critical time in our country at the present.
And as you note, Governor Ron DeSantis has called the Florida election system currently the gold standard. And it actually does, compared to a lot of places, run pretty well, although the issues around felony disenfranchisement that you mentioned as being so significant in the run up to the 2000 election still are there, despite the efforts of the voters to undo that.
Right, through a constitutional amendment. But I do agree in terms of if you look at other states and who reports when, that Florida is, in that regard, is setting a gold standard to how it reports its elections. I can't say we're the gold standard in other areas.
Final question on the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court in recent years has ruled in the Trump immunity case in a way that has a massive impact on the most recent presidential election. and seems poised to finish the job of demolishing the Voting Rights Act, which it so grievously weakened in the Shelby County case. Do you think the U.S. Supreme Court today is living up to what a court should do, and how much of that, in your mind, is different from what you saw in 2000, and how much is similar?
That's probably a answer for another podcast, but I believe that once that executive immunity case was decided, that and other cases that were decided 5-4 have shown this present court to be making political decisions, not based on precedent, not based on legal theories. Sometimes I feel that they are making it up as they go along to get a result, which, probably that's what criticism might have been what we were doing. And obviously I'm here to defend that, because I know from my colleagues in that time that that is not what occurred. But unfortunately, I think we are at a time where we're at a turning point. And we all have to step up to the plate to do our part to protect the right to vote, to protect fair and free elections, and for voters to be heard.
Justice Periante, thank you so much for being with us.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Michael.
I want to finish up with a few thoughts, a few personal observations about all this from the distance of 25 years. At the time, as many of you remember, and all of us can imagine, it was pretty intense. And it really felt like quite a bit rode on those footnotes and those decisions and those cases and what was going on. We have a bit more perspective over time. I want to share three things that seem to me to be the most important takeaways from that. The first is to understand just how difficult a position everybody involved was during that case, even the U.S. Supreme Court, who I've criticized a lot for decisions that I think have been misguided or political or even partisan. I think that you had this extraordinary phenomenon of a basically tie election, and it was going to be difficult for any system to come up with a way to adjudicate it, to decide it, that people across the board thought was fair. And of course, under those circumstances, it's always best to fall back on what the laws are, what the tried and true methods are. But there's a reason why this case has not, in a lot of ways, had the impact on American law, on American jurisprudence, on other decisions that the Supreme Court's made that you might have thought it would have at the time. One of the things that David Boies mentioned that's noteworthy in this decision is that the court says, oh, this is really only to apply to this particular instance. Some of you know the Mission Impossible instructions where the tape destroys itself after one playing. It was kind of like that. And it's even as a legal matter striking that the decision to use the Equal Protection Clause, which has always been wielded as a tool for equality by people like Justice William Brennan, who the Brennan Center is named after, and this time was used by Clarence Thomas and other people of that faction, has not been used again in this way in elections, at least not much. Even in cases that were nearby in terms of the doctrine, the independent state legislature theory case, Moore versus Harper, where this current Supreme Court made clear that state constitutions govern elections in states, that states are the principal people running elections, that states courts have a considerable role, that there could be some oversight by the U.S. Supreme Court, but there really wasn't a robust citation to Bush v. Gore. They kind of hinted at it and danced around it. So in one way, Bush v. Gore was its own thing, did not actually have the big impact on American law that a lot of people, many people at least, feared it might. That's one thing in 25 years experience. The second, though, much more significant, I think, in the end, was what it revealed about the election system in the United States. Not just the rulings, not just what the Supreme Court did, but the whole thing. we learned that in so many fundamental ways, the way we ran elections in the United States was ramshackle. It had not been updated. There were things that predated these court cases that Justice Pariente mentioned that were really troubling, even if they weren't the basis for these rulings. The Brennan Center over the years has been involved in this. Florida has a system of felony disenfranchisement where you are basically barred for a lifetime from voting if you have a past criminal conviction going back decades. There were people who were wrongly purged from the rolls. We learned that the voting machines were a mess, that it was often hard to count the results. We learned that there was such a thing as a hanging chad and other mysterious things that turned out to matter a lot. And so two things happened as a result of this. One was there has been a really encouraging move across the country to upgrade the way we run elections since Florida 2000. There was bipartisan legislation, the Help America Vote Act, for example, that required states to get electronic voting machines. Now, that was a problem because the electronic machines, while doing things a lot better than the Florida system had most of the ways, couldn't easily have a recount. So voting rights advocates, people like at the Brennan Center, a group called Verified Voting and others have said, no, you need a paper record so that you can actually check to see if the results are accurate. And that's how we vote today all across the country. There actually was this significant upgrade, more money from the federal government for states and for counties to run elections, and a lot of other things. That all flowed out of it. But something else flowed out of it that was not so good, or that at least has marked and changed our divided and polarized political environment right now. Both political parties learned something from what happened in Florida. Now, I worked in politics before that. I was chief speechwriter to President Bill Clinton. I was very involved in running the messaging for what was his 1996 reelection campaign. And in those days, so much of politics revolved around appealing to a fairly narrow sliver of swing voters. And that had its own problems. But what the parties came away from was thinking, oh my goodness, voting really matters. Turnout really matters. You saw the beginning of the Republican push to enact restrictive voting laws, to make claims of voter fraud, really starting from this recognition. And you saw also among the Democrats something they had not done before, which was to really focus on turnout, on boosting participation. It's now 25 years later. With the changing political demographics, a lot of that stuff is scrambled. But the voting fights, the polarized and partisan voting fights of the last 2.5 decades started, I always said, at about 4 a.m. that first election night in Florida. That's part of the way this has played out, I would say, in a second sense, in the broader political scene. But there's a third thing for us to focus on, and it's really striking. When the Supreme Court of the United States issued its ruling, it was 5-4 in effect. It was very confusing. People couldn't really figure out what it was saying at first, but it was 5-4. And it effectively gave George W. Bush the victory. The country accepted it. Al Gore, the losing candidate, gave a really stirring statement accepting it. The credibility at that moment of the U.S. Supreme Court was quite high. And that was pretty critical for the court. And it was pretty important, it turns out, in the fact that this wasn't such an earthquake of a ruling. Imagine if something like this happened now. This Supreme Court, over time, has gotten more and more involved in electoral politics in ways that have been increasingly destructive. It's a irony, or maybe not an irony, but one of the consequences of Bush being in office is that he nominated John Roberts and a number of the other justices, or Sam Alito, actually. And John Roberts said when he was confirmed, oh, I just want to call balls on strikes. But when it comes to democracy, the very kinds of issues that were at play in Bush v. Gore, he has been an activist, crusading judge aiming to undermine the laws of American democracy going back decades and even centuries. Citizens United in 2010, Shelby County gutting the Voting Rights Act in 2013. Citizens United, of course, being one of the decisions obliterating the campaign finance laws in the United States, all the way up to the decision on presidential immunity, which, while not about the election, meant that Donald Trump would never face legal consequences for trying to overthrow the returns in 2020 before the election, and maybe ever. And now the kinds of interventions we see where the Supreme Court right now, on this anniversary of Bush v. Gore, is considering finishing the job of gutting the Voting Rights Act, giving a green light for Texas to run its elections with an egregiously gerrymandered map, using what's called the shadow docket, and much, much more. Now, Ben Ginsburg made the point that a lot of that stuff really came much later with a different configuration in the Supreme Court. But it is just a sign of how self-undermining the Supreme Court has been in its own treatment of the law of democracy, that were it to face a question like this, were it to face something as difficult as what do we do with a tie election? How do we get involved? When do we stay out? When do we get involved? The reaction of the public undoubtedly would be very different. The Supreme Court of the United States has its power because it has credibility, and it's credibility that it has earned over many years. When it squanders that credibility, when it acts, as Elena Kagan has said, not like a court, but like a political body, then it makes it much harder for the Supreme Court to do what we all would want a Supreme Court to do, which is to actually uphold the Constitution and play its very particular, if limited, role in our American political system. It's not quite the butterfly effect of the wings flapping that we hear about. Bush v. Gore was a big deal, but it's been a big deal not necessarily in the ways that people thought it was at the time, but in ways that we see playing out now in what I think is a broken political system that urgently needs repair and renewal. Lots to think about. Thank you so much for joining us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends. Please let people know. Please give us ratings on the various platforms. And you can always subscribe to our written newsletter, The Briefing, on a lot of these and many other issues. Thank you.